through the whole pipeline, all the way from what hospitals are emergency responders sending them to how are they making decisions on scene, to how are our, as Abhidan, our president, put it earlier today, how are the real first responders, the citizens who are there, or the victims that are there in the moment, how do they make good decisions in the first 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes after something happens. More recently, unmanned aircraft systems and how those get, that type of technology gets implemented. And not just how do we fly it, although that's kind of an obvious, we hit that part first, but also how do we build it into the processes and systems of an organization? How do we give them the tools to adapt the technology, manage the data, secure the data, and set expectations of the chain of command on what that technology can do. And then going forward, we want to apply the same model to severe weather and severe weather decision-making and communications, mental health, and engaging and communicating with the communities, especially online, which I'll talk a little bit more about later in the discussion. And so the idea here and the theme that you'll see me hitting on again and again and again is we can't just think about it in terms of what's the idea and is it good. We have to think about using what we know about change management and decision making and the complex nature of the work that we do, how to get it through to implementation quickly, especially as challenges arise much more rapidly over the next 10 years.
We look forward to following up on some of those threads in the rest of the conversation. But before we do so, I'd like to give the word to my colleague, Dave Turetsky, to talk a little bit on his perspective of wrestling with these issues, not least from the Federal Communications Commission perspective.
So I'm going to talk about a problem, a need, and an opportunity. In the brief time I have, I'm going to draw on my experience in senior roles in business, law, and government, and academia. And more specifically, I'm going to draw on my perspectives as a former senior Department of Justice official in the Clinton administration in the area of competition, antitrust, and markets, as chief of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau at the Federal Communications Commission during the Obama administration, as a partner and practice leader in global law firms, as a senior executive in telecommunications sector businesses, and finally as an academic over the last few years. And the problem I'll be talking about is how to achieve greater resilience, reliability, and choice amongst critical infrastructure providers. The need I will be discussing is for more information from critical infrastructure private sector companies to be made publicly available in a timely fashion related to their individual performances in emergencies and recovery. Without this disclosure, the marketplace lacks critical information needed for informed consumer choice and to ensure that companies are accountable for their performance in emergencies. Their performance is often a result of their investment risk and other choices made away from public view. And without this disclosure, academics and civil society organizations lack important information they can use and should use to provide helpful analysis. This important opportunity that I'll be talking about is for regulators and legislators, in some instances, to go beyond voluntary public-private partnerships between business and government where necessary and ensure that the needed information is disclosed. I say that fully understanding that companies typically will not welcome and may oppose such requirements. This opportunity, ensuring disclosure of individual company performance information, is vital to enable the public to make informed choices between providers and for companies to be accountable for their performance. And it's vital for the public, including civil society, academic, and consumers, to be able to do research or participate more meaningfully in rulemaking and other regulatory proceedings than they can today. It shouldn't just be up to individual companies to decide whether to share relevant information based on what they think is in their interest, especially since regulators are frequently required by law to make decisions in rulemaking proceedings only based on information that actually makes it into the record before them. All of my experience makes me certain that the impact of inadequate disclosure, the consequences of it in their totality, is that people are less safe in a crisis than they would otherwise be. We need an honest dialogue and exchange about this, even though some stakeholders, will not welcome it. The government should not simply accept no for an answer, and it needs to be willing to steer through infrastructure's companies' opposition. And I hope academia will engage on this. Now let me start with some facts and principles. First, critical infrastructure in the United States is disproportionately owned by private companies, an estimated 80 to 90% of it. These critical infrastructure companies make different choices about risk, make different investments, adopt different business plans and strategies, vary in profitability, and have different levels of resources. These private companies do consider benefits and risks, but mostly from their own perspective, and they don't necessarily weigh the public interest broadly. Not all of the harm in emergencies, perhaps from them choosing a low level of investment in facilities in vulnerable areas in some cases, may fall on them, directly or even indirectly. The part of the harm that falls on others may, from their perspective, be what is referred to in economics as an externality. This is particularly true if consumers cannot compare services and don't realize that a competing service held up better in an emergency. In that circumstance, even some harm to a company's own customers may be an externality to that company, since few customers will elect to switch carriers in spite of suffering more harm than the customers of other carriers because they don't know that happened. Nevertheless, we generally view private ownership as a benefit. Private ownership, particularly where it does not involve a monopoly or a concentrated oligopoly, arguably enables competition, which leads to innovation and efficiency. And that makes people better off and could potentially make them safer too. To achieve these competitive benefits, however, we need well-functioning markets. This means the public having access to information about how companies perform so consumers can make knowledgeable comparisons and choices. Then consumers can hold companies accountable in the marketplace. That would likely trigger companies to invest more in vulnerable areas so that they are not known as the brand that is least likely to work in an emergency. Consumers have different preferences and values. Some just want the provider with the lowest price, but some would also want to weigh which service is more likely to work in an emergency caused by a hurricane. Perhaps they have health challenges and the ability to reach 911 in an emergency is a priority for them, or they need to communicate in an emergency with an elderly parent or a child. In communications, for example, the ability to get help through 911 is central to our emergency capabilities and response. 80 to 90% of calls to 911 are made on wireless phones. Depending on how a wireless company is impacted, people may not be able to complete calls to 911 for help. After Sandy, many cell towers were down, but not for all companies. And it was difficult for the public to originate 911 calls successfully in some places on some carriers. Companies are required to disclose very little to the public and often don't disclose the comparative information I'm talking about. Where critical infrastructure companies are regulated, if the laws authorize regulation and are broad enough, then this may be an important opportunity to address this problem. And also, when regulators make rules, they often offer a proposal or questions, and they invite the public to submit comments on the record. The regulator then must consider and decide based on that record. With some of the most important information only in the hands of the businesses themselves, or of regulators who have agreed not to disclose the information, companies often have more influence than the public in rulemaking proceedings. Finally, in counties experiencing major emergencies, the FCC receives information each day from cell phone companies that discloses the percentage of their own cell site outages in that county. But the FCC is not permitted to tell the public how each company is doing. It is only permitted to put out aggregated figures and show what percentage of cell sites are out of service in a county for all of the carriers together. While that provides overall situational awareness of how a sector is faring, and reflected the overall devastation in Puerto Rico, it makes it impossible for the public to compare how individual carriers perform in emergencies and to hold the carriers responsible for the strategies they choose. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Interesting to note the parallel in terms of the transparency issues that can arise, although perhaps the approaches to dealing with those may be different. David Kaufman brought up the issue of transparency with regard to grocery supply chains and the difficulty of the government in maintaining situational awareness. A nice parallel there, I think. So let's continue along the exploration of some of the challenges facing critical infrastructure operators. And I would like to invite Jerry McCarty to take the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Eric, and thank you very much for inviting me, and certainly the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. I know that there's a few people around this room that are fully aware that we're here today because of incidences that happened at the Port Authority. So we're very conscious and very sensitive to a lot of issues that not necessarily keep us awake at night, but certainly are reoccurring for us. This morning when I was listening to the President's Roundtable, I couldn't help but get struck by the fact that there's a great deal of resources with the state university system as well as the city university system. And not so much in the academic part, but in actually the application part. There's a great many scientists, technicians, physicists, people who have a great deal who can contribute to some of the real problems that people like myself and Terry are experiencing almost on a daily basis, either their actual issues or problems, or those that are perceived, or those that are created for us. And so for a lot that the academic world has been safe from having to deal with people like myself and Terry because there's an actual need. One of the examples of an academic involvement with the Port Authority is that after Tropical Storm Sandy, we sustained a great deal of damage due to flooding and surge. We engaged Stevens Institute, which is a university in Hoboken, New Jersey, that's predominantly in the marine area. They were able to develop for us a surge mapping prediction capability of 96 hours that would tell us what our flooding would look like at all of our facilities. And of course, if you're familiar with Port Authority, it's Kennedy Airport, Newark Airport, Port Newark, Port Elizabeth, all of those types of properties that are vulnerable to flooding because they're near flooding. But we also experience flooding which never happened before. And so how are we going to make sure that we don't see this again? Well, you know, if we can predict it, we can, to a certain degree, we can prevent it. And so it's the only one that exists in the United States, but it is a collaborative effort between the Port Authority and the academic community. Another issue with us is situational awareness within the Port District. The Port District is not just the New York metropolitan area, it's the world. Everything that touches the Port Authority touches someplace else in the world. How is that reflected? What is that impacting transportation, trade, etc.? And so with the help of NYU, we were able to go to 360 different entities throughout the world who constantly are feeding us information that stems from weather conditions to banking rates. So we have a great deal of experience with the academic world, but there's a great more that has to be done. There's a great deal that needs to be done. And the academic community is the only one we can think of that has that unblemished record of being able to do that type of research and development to address these key issues and key situations that are facing not only emergency management, because that's what I speak to, but naturally to this entire country, and how do we make ourselves harder and more preventable, and to the degree we can mitigate these type of situations. If I can have just a little bit of your liberty on this one, because you don't have a choice because I got the microphone. But the fact is that climate change has a great impact on the Port Authority as it does on any transportation entity, and any entity that's on the coast. And it's not just a case of rising water. That's an easy one. It's the impact that it has on the financial markets. What does it have on agriculture? What is it having on social movement? What does it have to do with the rate of poverty, the ability of people to actually take advantage of privileges that we have in this country because of factors that we don't know? This is where the academic community can certainly get engaged in and tell us, what do we need to do now, 5 years from now, 25 years, 50 years from now. I know, speaking only for myself and certainly not Terry, but how are we going to prepare to respond to issues that we don't have a full grasp of because we don't have the capability of developing those type of criteria? What type of equipment do we have? What type of person are we looking for in the future? All of these issues do not have just dealing with rising water. They have to do with everything else that is impacted as well as that. No, not minimizing flooding, and certainly I live with that every day. But this is where the academic community needs to bring their best minds and to look at this and say, how are we going to address this? What keeps me up at night? Besides the fact that there's a baby in the apartment next door, there's actually nothing. My job is to keep other people awake. But the fact of the matter is that the academic community has a key, vital role in research and development of the issues that we know and that we know that are emerging. But they're the only ones who are in that position to identify the emerging ones. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jerry. We'd like to work our way through this design thinking cycle, but now informed by the remarks of the opening remarks of the panelists, we'd like to give the panel an opportunity to pick up threads that have emerged. And I would like to thank Jerry also for pointing out that although this conference is using Hurricane Maria and the challenges that Puerto Rico has faced, some of the tragic outcomes that the people of Puerto Rico have had to endure as a point of departure, we're actually taking a broader focus. I had the privilege of doing some work out in California a couple of weeks ago, and the problem in California of late has not so much been too much water, but rather not enough and prolonged drought in some areas, then some rain, then the moment struggling with wildfires, and then seeing the way that the critical infrastructure systems for power were operating seemed to be linked to wildfire risk, and so deliberate protective measures, shutting down systems, creating power outages to manage other risks. And so what we're seeing is a very complex constellation of interconnected risks. So I would invite the panel and a little bit later the audience to think broadly about the challenges that we're facing. The word is free among the panelists to begin with.
Yeah, I would just add for the academic community that I think there are tremendous opportunities with regulators. Regulators need information in their record. They want to know, they want to make policy, and they want to do it intelligently. But I think too often the regulatory world, often in Washington, D.C., and the academic world just too infrequently get together and understand each other. They don't necessarily understand what's being done or what's pending in each other's world. Academics don't understand necessarily what the questions are that are being put out for comment that regulators are grappling with. And academics don't necessarily get credit for writing things that go into the public record and may influence policy. Too often they get credit for articles that may go into journals that don't really necessarily influence a lot of people. So I would say that there needs to be a closer link between academia and regulators, and I would say the initiative has to come from both sides, because regulators, it's a decentralized world of academia. Regulators don't necessarily know where to look or whatever, and So I think the onus is on both sides to move forward, and right now it's sort of a transaction cost problem and information problem, and it's not working the way it should.
And I think to jump off that and take it in a broader direction, I think that I've heard many different hazards over the last 6 hours or so here, and I've heard some solutions that have come up, but I think that something that underlies all of it is the fact that with the democratization of information, science is starting to, or is in danger of losing its grip on public opinion, which I think lies beneath all of this. And in terms of what keeps me up at night, I can think of hazard after hazard after hazard, but I think science needs to think about what it brings to the table other than just answers. Because what we're facing with blogs and with social media is that everybody seems to have answers. And these answers are usually retrospective, right? It's like, me talking about Daniel Jones in the recent Giants game last week. I can give him answers all day, but none of them are going to help him. Science can bring a rigor to it, but those answers need to be, and I think, Terry, you touched on this, it needs to be tied to something concrete, a deliverable, an outcome that's measurable and actionable. Because it faces an uphill battle anyway. Once emergency managers or first responders or regulators get into the thick of it, they sort of rely on their instinct and their experience, and you want to catch them in that planning cycle to get them to the point where they're seeing where science can be helpful and what the outcomes of using these more methodological approaches can help them. I think it's easy to look at some events that have happened recently, whether you look at the wildfires and questions on California's role in those wildfires, or Sharpie marks on a wiring diagram for hurricanes, and think that it's a top-down issue, but it's not. Information has become democratized in the public sphere, and already there's a gap that we've talked about between science and practitioners. That gap's going to continue to widen if we don't find a way to move past answers into solutions.
So I'm just going to build a little further on that, because as you were speaking, it struck me that government and academia are in precisely the same position with respect to relevance, right? Because as the information environment has shifted, that has driven changes in how and where people source their information and in whom and where they place their trust. So a decline in trust at the federal government level is not news. That's been going on for quite a while, but it's in the teens in terms of the percentage of the population that trusts the federal government to do what's right most or all of the time. It's higher at the state and local level, but trust in media has declined, trust in other institutions has been declining as well, and more and more people are trusting other individuals in their social networks as the credible sources for information. So that same question of relevance is every bit as important to government as I think it is to academia in the way that you just highlighted. And it just strikes me as an interesting area of opportunity when, perhaps without realizing it, we're both suffering for some of the changes that have happened in the information context. That's a great point.
Yeah, sure. A couple other key points that were made. I think government, especially emergency management, we're really good at planning for the last disaster. We kind of put a lot of effort into what worked, what didn't work, and we're not going to do that again. Big doctrinal changes and other things will come from that. And then you look at the 2017 hurricane season as an example, and all the effort that's gone into supply chain resiliency and lifelines and all these other things, which are great, but we're not as good about forward thinking. The things that we're not thinking about, the black swan events, to borrow a phrase, that's the stuff that keeps me up at night. The things I know about, I can plan for. The things I'm not even thinking about are the ones that you really have to hope that somebody else is and will inform you of, and you can get some energy around it. Then the challenge is peeling off some effort to focus on those things, because again, emergency managers often deal with the issue of the day. They know it's going to flood, so they're going to put effort into flooding, but aging infrastructure, some of these other issues don't always present themselves in every community. So trying to get people with limited resources and limited time to focus on many things can be a real challenge. I think it's trying to take this big picture view of risk and operationalize it or be able to provide some context to help us begin to tackle things in a systematic way and not just react to everything. We're really good at reacting to stuff. It's kind of the nature of our business, but you have to be a little more thoughtful, and I think, again, that's where academia can bring some insight.
You're absolutely right, Terry. We're very good at reacting to things, and one of the notions is that that's part of the job, is because while we can plan for a great many things, there's something that always pops up that is on somebody's radar screen as a priority, or something that actually does happen. I think the premise I have is that the emergency management is all-inclusive. There's a tendency for people outside of emergency management to believe that they really don't have a part to play in that, and I think that's a notion that is not rested in fact. It's probably more perception, and to a certain degree maybe it's even something else, but we don't need to go down that path. The more people who are involved in the issues, the greater chance that there's a solution. And there's a solution in different phases. Right now, the immediacy, and in the future. And there are people in academia who have that ability. One of the abilities I admire a great deal in the military is that they're looking through the windshield and the glass of the car in front of them to see what the car in front of that car is doing. There is that notion that we can leapfrog issues so that, in fact, we can anticipate something. We may not have the best something, but we may have something of a solution. And I don't want to talk in hypothetical terms because this just isn't beneficial for somebody like myself. But this is a field that is open to a lot of people who have a lot of thoughts and a lot of good ideas. And it's up to emergency management to encapsulate that and to put that into a product that's deliverable.
Thank you for that thought, Jerry. And I think there's a very valuable perspective there in terms of understanding when we're dealing with the kinds of wicked problems that we're facing, we need to think outside the box, we need to think creatively.
So you're having second thoughts about inviting me, aren't you? I can sense that now.
No. I think you're hitting the nail right on the head. And that often means not just putting yellow tape around the perimeter and letting the professionals handle it, which I think is the older paradigm of approaching these issues. David, since we have you here, Dave Kaufman, one of Dave's lasting contributions from the time that he was at FEMA was in formulating a whole community approach to emergency management, drawing on good practices from around the world, some ideas from the UN system, of course. But Dave, you can say a few words about how the whole community approach changes the relationship between the folks in uniform and the professional emergency managers and the communities.
Sure. So let me preface it and take liberty for a sec, because for me, one of the key points of origin in moving down that path was actually a convening around the topic of resilience that involved a mix of researchers, operators, and policy practitioners. And what was evident in the course of that conversation was we were having different conversations. And the policymakers were in office now with a short-term window of time in which to do something. And none of the research conversations were going to yield any results anywhere close to the time scale that would be useful. And so out of that emerged the need for a different kind of conversation that still ended up being a hybrid of those three bodies, but was much more organic and experiential. And so together with Eric and other colleagues, we ended up forming a 10-country policy community. It was very informal. That started going and looking at community experiences in crisis in different nations around the world, predominantly Western democracies, and trying to extract insights out of what happened. Why did it happen? What was it about it? What were the challenges that they represented? So you were in New Zealand when we went, and we were talking to one of the founders of the Student Army in the aftermath of the Christchurch earthquake. And and I forget the gentleman's name at the moment, but there was a point in the conversation where he paused and he realized that he had senior level folks from half a dozen different countries sitting in front of him, and he said, I have a charge for you, and paraphrasing him, is you need to develop the capability to scan real time for what's happening and what's emerging. Because things are happening and you don't recognize them quickly enough, and when you do, you don't know what to do with them. And he reflected, this was his application of the emergent experience of the student army. Right, and that's not an isolated instance. We could talk about the Mud Army in Brisbane, Australia, another place that we went to listen to. We could talk about the Occupy movement pivoting. We could talk about the Cajun Navy. We could talk about the boat lift on Lower Manhattan. You guys get the point. But that is a difficult challenge for government. And it's outside the skill base for many practitioners in the field to be looking at that. But there are other fields that work in that way where there's tremendous opportunity. So you asked me to talk about whole community. Whole community is really nothing more than embracing the value proposition behind, pick your example, public health, IOM's definition of public health, what we as a society do collectively to assure the conditions for people to be healthy. Societal, it's about setting conditions. It is not what government does to cure the sick. That is a nice, slight bastardization, but not too much, of how we practice emergency management. Another example, if you like, community-oriented policing. Build community-based partnerships, realign policing practices to support those partnerships and the needs and priorities of those communities, right? Same lessons out of international development, same lessons out of counterinsurgency strategy. But difficult for us to apply in practice. Whole community was nothing more than trying to remind us that disasters don't happen to governments, they happen to communities and to society, and that includes the public, that includes the business community, that includes academia, that includes philanthropy. It's all of us. And if we focus purely on, I'm generalizing, but purely on building out the capacities of government with the expectation that government will address the aftermath of a disaster, we're talking about response, then we are grossly limiting ourselves in that construct. And so there are guidelines and principles. FEMA put doctrine out on this, but it has really taken root rhetorically, but it is still something that the field is struggling with understanding. How do I do that? How do I apply community-based practice, especially when I have a part-time emergency manager for a county or small staff and very limited bandwidth and resources? And so I think there's a real opportunity to illuminate that while at the same time leveraging the prevalence of academic institutions throughout our communities, the research that they engage in, the students that they are educating and are grooming, etc., to create those opportunities and do that. I find exceptional opportunity for more integrative curriculum and multidisciplinary practice that blends practice across domains. So